Hey everybody, Travis Bowman here. Let's take a look at some controllers by RetroFighters specifically designed for our friend the Sega Dreamcast. Now we've got two iterations to look at today. So on the right you can see the box for the Striker DC. That's going to be the wired gamepad that they released a few years ago. And on the left we have the latest iteration, which is pretty much the same thing, but this time we've got a fully wireless controller for our Dreamcast. And if you've been a fan of the system for many years like I have, you'll realize just how big of a deal that is. It's like we get to see all our other friends like the Genesis and the Sega Saturn get all sorts of these cool wireless controllers for these systems, and the Dreamcast has just been kind of left behind. No longer. We finally have an affordable solution. So here we go. Here's our wireless version of the Striker DC for the Sega Dreamcast from RetroFighters. So everything is intact as it should be, just like on a regular Dreamcast controller. It's your Dreamcast button layout, but it's kind of a more modern design, like akin to more like an Xbox or a PlayStation style controller. It's been kind of modernized to be a little bit more comfortable for pretty much everybody. So this controller comes in a few colors. You can get the standard white. I chose to go with this really cool transparent blue color just because I've got the original Dreamcast controller to match it. And you'll notice that I put a Nintendo Switch kind of grip there on that a long time ago. I don't know why I did that, but there it is nevertheless. And they got this color pretty darn spot on. I think the RetroFighters is just a little bit darker compared to the original translucent blue for that Dreamcast controller, but still, it's really cool to have these two side by side like this. Let's go ahead and talk about what the Striker DC wireless is going to offer you. This is only for the Sega Dreamcast. You can't use this on any other consoles or on your PC or anything like that. We've got the Hall Effect analog stick, so you don't have to worry about drifting in the future. It comes with a VMU Dock, which we're about to take a close look at. It's using 2.4 gigahertz wireless technology for that low latency, so we're not dealing with Bluetooth. We're trying to get the best latency we possibly can for our Dreamcast. You can go up to 30 feet away from your Dreamcast. It's nice that you've got some wiggle room there. Got wireless vibration. You can update the firmware on both the controller and the dongle. They claim to have a very comfortable and accurate D-pad. You've got some turbo functionality and USB-C rechargeable battery that will last you 10 hours. I'm just super excited that we finally have an option for something like this, because before this you could get a Bluetooth wireless Dreamcast controller, but it was extremely expensive and it was the real deal. Somebody got a bunch of Dreamcast controllers, legitimate ones, and kind of turned them into a Bluetooth wireless solution, and that's really cool, and I would love to have one of those, but the problem is that controller is super expensive, man. I don't know how much it is right now. I remember it being close to $200, and I like the Dreamcast, but I just can't justify spending that much for a wireless controller. But that's where the Striker DC comes in. So let's talk about how this thing feels in your hands. It feels actually pretty darn good, to be honest. It's a really nice controller. It's got a decent weight to it. It's not super light, but it's not super heavy either. And a big thing that people are going to notice is the lack of the VMU. You can't put a VMU in this controller, and that's where this dongle comes into play. So here's the dongle that comes with your RetroFighters controller, and you just plug it into your Dreamcast like so, just like normal. You can only have one VMU in it at a time, which is kind of a bummer, but I understand why they did that. Now this has a USB-C port right there as well, so you can update the firmware on both the dongle and the controller. By the way, controller's got a USB-C for charging. As far as pairing these things up, I've never had any issues thus far. It's actually pretty darn simple. You just plug this guy in just like you normally would, and then you've got a pair button back here. If you're having issues, just click that pair button, and you can do the same thing with the VMU dongle with this button right there, and it pairs right up. I've never had an issue where it just wouldn't pair, which, you know, that is to be expected because these things are designed to communicate with only each other. As far as the buttons are concerned, RetroFighters has an interesting clickiness to them that I've noticed over the years. I've bought quite a few of their controllers for different systems at this point. So you'll hear the click, and then the click when you release the button. So it's like a double click type situation. These buttons are quite clicky, and I'm sure you can hear that. I'll try to get a little closer. I'm just mashing these buttons. And the start button. So they are a little noisy. The stick is great. I really do love the stick, and I find it kind of, I don't know, satisfying that this actually clicks in, just like your other controllers of the modern era, like your Xbox and PlayStation. It doesn't do anything. You can't like map it to anything, but I don't know. I just like the fact that it clicks in. Now you've got your turbo toggle over here, as well as your clear if you want to get rid of that turbo in your start button. So the Dreamcast controller had only 2 triggers. They've kind of done an interesting thing with this controller because you've got the triggers and you've got buttons. So both of these do the same thing on your Dreamcast. It's just the R button and then the L button. But you have the option to use the triggers there, analog triggers, just like the Dreamcast, or you can just press a button, and that's pretty nice. Now that we've talked about the controller, we can talk about something that I've been dying to talk about, and I hope you guys will join me on this. I really appreciate what RetroFighters has done here. This is an amazing thing for our Sega Dreamcast, and it's just so nice to have a wireless controller that's affordable. So I'm really appreciative of RetroFighters for that. However, the big elephant in the room, the name RetroFighters implies that they are big fans of fighting games. Look how much room there is right here. You see, when I'm holding this, my thumb naturally wants to kind of rest right here. So I think you guys might know what I'm getting at, and that is, why would you not make this a 6-button layout right here? There is plenty of room right there for an extra set of buttons. And of course I'm talking about the games on the Sega Dreamcast that were arcade perfect 2D fighting games. There's so many of them. Namely, this guy right here, Marvel vs. Capcom 2, and you have Street Fighter Alpha 3, all the Street Fighter games. There's so many great fighting games that could utilize that classic Sega 3-button arcade layout, and I just hate that this controller doesn't have that. I don't know about you guys, but I am not the biggest fan of using the triggers, even if they are buttons. You know, I'm not a Super Nintendo guy. I'm a Sega Genesis 6-button controller guy, you know, and I just wish they would have done that. But, you know, the Dreamcast controller, if we take a look at that for just a minute, it's not perfect. It never was. You know, it's an incredibly innovative design for the time. It's a beautiful controller, and I love the spaceship design. A lot of people hate it because of the way that it's laid out back here, and people love to complain about the fact that you have to do this, you know, your cable's on the wrong side of the controller. Well, of course it is. That's where your VMUs go, you know. If you add somewhere, you got to subtract from somewhere. But this controller was never perfect. It should have been a 6-button design, in my opinion. Yes, it's nice to have these analog triggers and everything, but for fighting games, not so much. And the D-pad, I don't know why they chose to go with this D-pad instead of trying to replicate some of their earlier controllers, such as the Sega Genesis and the Sega Saturn pad, arguably one of the best 2D controllers of all time. The D-pad here, it's okay. It works for most things. I wouldn't say this is a great D-pad for your fighting games necessarily. I find it kind of difficult to do these quarter circles for these Hadoukens and whatnot that you might do with this controller. It's a little stiff, and we can see right here, I'm pressing down dead center right there, and I can press that whole thing in and rotate it like so. I'm not trying to hate on this controller. Don't get me wrong. I really, really like it. It's just perfect for certain games. Like, for example, Jet Grind Radio here. It's a great game that utilizes the analog stick. And that's the thing about the Sega Dreamcast. Some of the games utilize the analog stick, and some of them utilize the D-pad more. So for a game like Jet Grind Radio, it's absolutely perfect. For a game like Phantasy Star Online, it's really, really good. Now, the Dreamcast only had one analog stick, while the rest of the competition consoles had two. And a lot of people kind of look down on the Dreamcast for that, but you have to remember that this machine was so awesome for these arcade ports, and for the most part, you really didn't need another analog stick. So let's talk about the triggers for a second. There's a lot of distance, I feel, before we actually get to the point of clicking there. And these feel very, very thin as I'm playing with them right now. They're very easy to move. There's not a lot of resistance to them. Although this is a big upgrade from their previous controller, which we're going to take a look at in a second. I do like the shoulder buttons. They have a really nice click to them, and for the most part, they work just fine. I've never had any issues with those at all. Like I said, the buttons, they're very clicky. Very, very clicky. Enough that I'm going to notice it and bring it up in this video, but is it that bothersome? Not really. It's just a little clickier than some of the controllers that I've tried in the past. I know it sounds like I'm being negative about this controller, but I really do enjoy it. I consider myself to be a Dreamcast enthusiast, and this is pretty much going to be my Dreamcast controller from here on out, just because of the convenience of it. It still works just like a Dreamcast controller would. It's just a little different, a little modernized, and that's totally fine. I really, really enjoy it for the games on the Dreamcast, except for those 2D fighting games. And you know, that's the thing about the Dreamcast. There's so many different games, and they covered so much ground with all of these different styles of gameplay. When you look at the 2D fighters, the controllers just weren't optimized for both. It's like they couldn't figure it out at the time. Do we want this to be a 3D controller, or do we want it to be a 2D controller? And I just wish that they went with something a little more Sega Saturn oriented. So Retro Fighters, if you're watching this, thank you so much for making this controller. If I were to give you constructive criticism, I would say let's make the D-pad a little bit more Sega Saturn-like, and let's add these two buttons right here. You can map them to the triggers if you want, but give us the option, please. Alright, so let's have a look-see at the original Retro Fighters controller. I've used the crap out of this controller, but be warned, I'm about to show you this and you might not like what you see. Okay, so here's my Retro Fighters controller. It looks a little rough at this point. It's particularly the stick right here. You can see it's yellowed. And this controller is not really that old. I got it a couple of years ago. Now, when I store my controllers, I typically put it in a big Ziploc bag and I'll store them away to keep all the dust and dirt and grime from getting to them. My problem was I had this controller sitting in a spot where the sun was coming through the window. And you can see this used to be white, but now it's quite yellowed. I haven't been using this controller very much. The only reason I brought it out was to show you guys and do a review of it with the wireless version here. So the stick on the wireless version is a little bit better than this guy over here. And you can still click this in, not that it matters. But I just feel like the other stick feels a little better. And it's a little bit more sturdy of a stick, I would say. The D-pad moves a lot more on this controller than it does on the other one. I don't know if I just haven't broken the other one in as much. But of course on this Retro Fighters controller here, it is wired, and that's how they decided to combat this problem of having the wire come out on the bottom of the controller. They decided to kind of put it back there, which is a nice touch. You can have two VMUs in this controller. Now, I really did not like this controller when I first got it, and it's still not one of my favorites, and I'll tell you why. The plastic feels just a little brittle, almost, you know? If I dropped this hard enough, it would probably break. That's how I feel with it. It's nothing too absurd, I don't think. I don't think it's gonna break just by me using it. But that being said, these triggers are an issue for me. The buttons up here are very clicky, and they feel just fine. But my problem is this. these triggers tend to want to pop out, and you can see it's happened on both of them, and I believe this one has broken on the left side. If you listen, you can really hear something kind of rattling around inside. And I know you're looking at this and thinking that I just don't take care of my controllers. I promise you that's not the case. Like I said, I put them in a Ziploc bag, and when this broke and this trigger kind of came apart like this, and you can kind of see on camera this little piece in there, it must have broken off. I take very good care of my controllers, and this just kind of happened one day. And that's why I haven't used it, because I just, it kind of rubbed me the wrong way that it broke. But all credit to RetroFighters. They have really made some gigantic improvements with this controller. To address the issues that I had with this one, this plastic does not feel brittle at all. It feels like a very robust controller in comparison. The clickiness of the buttons is still there. And the clickiness of the shoulder buttons is there. It's a lot clickier on the wired version here. But overall, this is a better controller in my opinion. It was really cool to get this. I was really a big fan of them putting a new Dreamcast controller out. And I really do like RetroFighters. They've got a lot of really cool controllers for various systems. I just don't believe that their Dreamcast controllers are some of the best that they have to offer, and that's totally fine. The wireless controller is obviously the best choice between the two for a multitude of different reasons. RetroFighters, their goal is to make a controller that's a more modernized version of what we've grown up with and grown to love. But I think what's going on is that this is a good representation of the Dreamcast controller, because on the original, the D-pad's not the best, but it's definitely usable. It's not that great to have these triggers back here when in reality pretty much everybody wanted a 6-button layout. The same can be said about this controller. The D-pad is not my favorite. It's definitely doable. I can accomplish all sorts of things in Street Fighter, but it's just not that Sega D-pad that I wish it was. Okay, so let's talk about this dongle here. So let me unplug it from the Dreamcast real quick. This is what we're looking at. It's actually a pretty cool design, and I understand why they went this route. It's because either it would take a lot of battery life to have a VMU inside of the controller. It would add too much weight to have the battery in here. We've got these rubber pads here, so when you sit it on your desk, it doesn't really want to move so much, which is good. And when you plug it in your Dreamcast, it sits right there on your table, and it looks just fine. The issue that I'm having with it personally is that I've got a lot of consoles. I've got 2 Dreamcasts hooked up in my house, one in my office and another in my living room where I've got all my other consoles hooked up. They're all on wire racks, so I don't have a lot of room to put this dongle on, and it's designed to be sitting on a surface. And I have experimented with dangling the dongle. It's a pretty sturdy cable. I wouldn't recommend doing this. Honestly, when I am playing the Dreamcast with this controller, I'll just flip this VMU holder up here and I'll set it on top of the Dreamcast like so. And it's not the most aesthetically pleasing thing, but it's functional. Honestly, RetroFighters makes really good stuff. Like I said, I just feel like the Dreamcast is not their best work, and that's totally fine. Some of my favorites are the N64 controller, the Brawler 64. I'm a really big fan of that controller. I did a review of that a while back. I also have the Xbox Hunter controller that I'm going to be reviewing next. I love that controller, man. That's probably one of my favorite controllers that I've ever used in quite some time, and I'm really excited to do the review video for that. Now, if you want to go wired, this isn't necessarily a bad choice. Like I said, I'm kind of bummed that the triggers kind of broke on me a little bit, and I'm not the only person that had this issue. The reason that this controller was initially very attractive to me is the fact that, yeah, it's got a 10-foot cord, which is really nice, but I liked the placement of the stick and the modern feel of this controller, and that's mainly because I was super into Phantasy Star Online. You can still play that game online even today. And I was using the original Dreamcast controller. In that game, there was a lot of walking, a lot of moving around, and you'll spend a lot of time pressing up on the analog stick. This is me holding up for a long period of time. This really kind of hurt my thumb a little bit doing this on that controller for so long, and so that's why I wanted to try this controller in the first place. And it was a $50 controller at the time, I believe, so I figured, yeah, why not? And this is a much better alternative, in my opinion. It's hard for me to show on camera, but it does feel a little bit better to move forward on a stick in this position. So I really want to thank my friends at Stone Age Gamer for sending me this RetroFighters Striker DC for review. I really appreciate that. This marks the first time that an American company has sent me some retro video game stuff for review, and I really appreciate that. It's super cool. I've been buying stuff from Stone Age Gamer for a very long time. Got a lot of respect for them. They're really cool guys. Now, I bought this RetroFighters controller over here, this wired one. I bought it myself years ago, but they did send me this wireless one for review, and I'm really appreciative of that. I just wanted to make this video so you can see what it would be like to have a RetroFighters Striker DC, whether it's the wired one or the wireless one, to give you an idea of what it would be like if you owned one. So let me know what you guys think about these two controllers. Have you ever used them before? Do you have a preference on which one you'd like to get? Please let me know the answers to all those questions in the comment section below. Thanks for subscribing, and I'll catch you guys at the next video. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.